movement. And yes, this would encompass lots of different traditions within Christianity, but Christianity brought so much good into the So again, it is good to be here. I know we have several visitors with us. We're very happy that you are here with us. If you have not been here, we just started last week a series on how Christianity brought so much good into the world. So as you can see, it's titled, How Christianity Changed the World. The premise is that Christianity as a movement, and yes, this would encompass lots of different traditions within Christianity, but Christianity as a movement has changed the world and brought about so many good things that we now take for granted in ways that really are not talked about a whole lot in mainstream culture, as it were. Typically, Christianity is portrayed as something that's, anti-science, very bigoted, that kind of thing, and it's in the way of progress is usually how it is construed. But really, the truth is, as we're going to see throughout this series, is that Christianity is responsible for a lot of the good things that we now take for granted. Things such as hospitals, the end of slavery, things such as fast access to education, and we could go on and on. Universal belief in human rights. These things are a Christian inheritance, and we're telling these stories because it's important for people to know the good that Christianity is responsible for. And so last week what we discussed is, we watched that Richard Dawkins clip. If you were here, you remember what we're talking about. But basically, we discussed how Christians and Christianity brought about the good, but now that Christianity is being abandoned in mass swaths of people, we're seeing a departure from Christian culture. And Richard Dawkins, in that interview that we looked at, was lamenting the loss of Christian culture. Even though he called himself an atheist, an unbeliever, he does not believe in God, he said that really he hates the fact that we're no longer living, he's talking about Europe especially, and Britain particularly, in a culturally Christian nation. He says a lot of the things that he likes and that he takes for granted are the inheritance of Christianity. And now that you have other ideologies moving in, such as Islam, he's lamenting that fact. He says, we need to stay a culturally Christian nation. Well, the point is that if you want Christian things, Christian beliefs, a lot of the good things that we now take for granted, you need Christian underlying presuppositions. People need to believe Christian things in order to pursue Christian good. It's impossible, especially on a societal level, to pursue Christian good apart from those fundamental Christian beliefs. And so we saw that in that clip last week with Dawkins. We saw, and I talked about some of these people. Sam Harris, he's also lamenting some of the things that have happened now as we move away from Christianity. I didn't mention this woman, but she's actually probably the smartest of them, ironically, that was part of the New Atheist movement back in the early 2000s. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, she actually became Catholic recently and wrote a whole article about how we need Christianity in order to sustain civilization, and that it's impossible to pursue the good apart from a belief in the transcendent God that Christianity has. And so, you could talk about this a lot. I think the main premise from last week was that if we can convince people that Christianity is responsible for so much of the good that we take for granted, then they'll be more likely to listen to us when it comes to more of our dogmatic claims, such as the fact that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died for our sins, and that he's been raised again on the third day. Because even though a lot of modern people struggle with religious beliefs, such as believing that Jesus has been raised from the dead, a lot of people do still see that there is objective goodness, and the more that we move away from that, the worse things get, and people can see that even if they're not necessarily Christian. And so I should have told this story last week, but actually we had a college student last semester who we ended up baptizing for this very reason, because he came to church one day and met some people, and then he and I went and ate a couple times and everything. And basically, long story short, he said, some of this stuff that I'm learning in some of these classes at IU that I'm having having to take is really not good. And I know it's not good, but I don't really have the best way to articulate why it's not good. And so he came to church, because we're right by IU, looking for an alternative to what he was hearing. And I guess he liked the alternative. And so we were able to share with him more of the dogmatic claims that we pursue good because we believe goodness is embodied in the person of Jesus, and that Jesus died for us, and he loves us, and he loves everybody else, and he defeated sin and death on the cross and through the resurrection, and you can have freedom in him, and you can join in God in his mission to bring goodness, to bring his kingdom to earth as it is in heaven. And that resonated with him, and he was baptized. And so I think that this message can resonate with a lot of people in our modern world if we can get it out. So today we are going to be talking about how Christianity changed marriage for the better. So marriage obviously is a big topic. By the way, I really appreciate the reception last week and the cards and the gifts and all that. Very much appreciate that. But one thing that most of you did was you included my wife in your notes and in your cards and everything. And that's so important because it means you understand that, what we do as couples, we're not doing alone. Like, she is every bit as responsible for any accomplishments that I've ever had as I am, because she's been right there with me, supporting me. We're no longer two, but one, as Joshua read for us this morning when Jesus is speaking about marriage. And so we're going to talk about how Christianity helped to bring this about in the world and bring about this understanding of marriage. And we'll also talk about why deviating from the Christian understanding of marriage can lead to dire consequences. Okay, so with that said, let's get into it. Mark chapter 10. We'll read verses 2 through 11. It's basically a parallel passage to Matthew, but let's go ahead and read it. It says, some Pharisees came, and to test him they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And he answered them, what did Moses command you? And they said, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and then to divorce her. But Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So, I was talking to a group of people, won't say who, they were a little on the older side, and we were talking about, this sermon that I was going to give this Sunday, and I was like, yeah, we all know, what time of the year it is, so this is pretty appropriate. And they were kind of looking at each other, and they're like, what do you mean, what time of the year it is? And I said it's Pride Month, and it tells you the divide, I think, between younger people and older people, because all of us who have kids that watch TV and, all that, get emails from corporations, we know, like, it's there, we're here, but sometimes people who don't have that maybe aren't as plugged in. But a lot of people are talking about this kind of thing at this time of year. And so I think it's a really relevant message for us to talk about now, because marriage is a fundamental institution for societies. It's fundamental to Christian faith. And so it's something that we really need to be on the same page about. And I think that the Christian understanding of marriage has gotten a bad rap, obviously, in the last 20 years. A lot of people see it as hateful or mean-spirited or bigoted or what have you. But as we kind of talked about last year, there is a reason why marriage has been defined in the way that it has been defined by Christ and then subsequently by his followers. So, first of all, let's get some basics. Christ's understanding of marriage was that of monogamy between a man and a woman. So between one man and one woman, not multiple of each or one and then multiple. That obviously was different than some past cultures that practiced polygamy. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But this, by definition, excludes all other combinations. And you have to see from a Christian standpoint why Christ says that marriage is what it is. So if you go to Mark 10, we just read it, and if you go to verse 6, Jesus references creation, and he's quoting from Genesis there. He says, but God made them male and female. And then he says, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So for what reason shall a man leave his father and mother and be made one flesh with his wife? Well, the reason is because God has made them male and female. That is Jesus' justification for marriage. This is important because a lot of times we will think that, if you ask, what is the foundation of marriage? A lot of people might say love. And love is a big part of marriage. Don't get me wrong. You need to love whoever you marry. That's obviously true. But love is not the foundation of marriage according to Jesus. And this is vital. Because if you say that love is the foundation of marriage, then obviously it would follow logically that, well, if love is the foundation of marriage, then you can love whoever you want. And if two people love each other, then why can those two people not just get married regardless of their biological sex? That would be the logical entailment of saying that love is the foundation of marriage itself. But that's not what Jesus said. Yes, love is important, and we should love our spouse, certainly. But the foundation for marriage is that God has made them male and female. That's what Jesus points to when he's talking about why marriage is what it is. It is the compatibility of the man and the woman that is the foundation for marriage itself. It's why the two can become one flesh and nothing else can. In fact, when you go back to Genesis, and it's talking about that, he then tells them, God tells Adam and Eve eventually to be fruitful and to multiply, to go into all the earth and multiply. And they can do that because they are man and woman. The man and the woman are compatible to create life in principle. Now, yes, there are certain instances where life may not be able to be created for any number of reasons, but in principle, only one man and one woman can create life. And marriage is the context, the social, the political, and the religious context wherein procreation takes place. Can you imagine a world where there is no marriage and you just have a bunch of kids and you have no legal responsibility for the kids that you have? You have no social pressure to take care of your family, to take care of those that you've produced? Can you imagine a world where that was the case? Well, obviously you can't. That's why marriage has been a thing for a very long time, even before Christianity. So marriage between a man and a woman is given by God for our good. It's defined by Christ for this manner, because only one man and one woman can create life, and the compatibility of man and woman is what is the foundation for marriage from a Christian perspective. Now, I'm talking to Christians today. If somebody was not a Christian, they might say, well, who cares what Jesus says about marriage? And they may be correct, because as a non-Christian, they may not care what Christ has to say about marriage. Of course, then you may ask the question, well, then what is marriage, and how do you define marriage? And then at that point, once you deviate from the Christian understanding of marriage, there's nothing to stop you from saying, well, marriage is between 3 people, 4 people, 6 people. Who's to say? Why is it only 2 people? You see, that's kind of the question that never gets asked in culture. It's like, if marriage can be between a man and a man or a woman and a woman, why would it just be limited to those 2 people? Well, it's just kind of arbitrary at that point. It's not because they can create life, because only a man and a woman can create life. So we say that marriage is what it is because we believe that Christ has defined it this way, and he has done it for our good. So that's one way that Christianity has helped to define marriage, even though, as some would point out, it wasn't like gay marriage was always legal in all societies, even in the Roman Empire from time to time. That's a complicated history, not to get too much into that. But the next aspect of marriage I want to talk about, and it's maybe a little more touchy for some people, because most of us, if you've grown up in church, or if you're a Christian, you believe in the first part of what I've said about what Christian marriage is, and that's an important aspect. But the next way that Christianity changed marriage was actually perhaps more radical than defining it simply as monogamous between a man and a woman. Christianity did not introduce monogamy into the world. Monogamy was present in some societies, obviously in Jewish societies. Before Christ came along, it was the expectation. It was the expectation in most of Rome, though some say that polygamy could still be practiced in some provinces. It gets kind of complicated when you get into the history. But where Christianity differed from other societies at the time is that it said that marriage was not merely a political institution or a social institution. See, in the Roman Empire, for example, oftentimes people would become married in order to tie together families or to make sure you ensure that people get your inheritance and that kind of thing, right? So it was a political tool. It was a social tool. And obviously, marriage still serves somewhat of that purpose today. If you're married and you die, your spouse gets your stuff. And so we all know that it's still somewhat a part of marriage today. But where Christianity differed was marriage was not merely a political and social reality. It was not merely a political and social context wherein procreation could take place. Marriage was divinely instituted by God. And the act of marriage is not something that you just decide to do at the courthouse one day. Marriage is something that God does to you. God is the one who joins the man and the woman together to become one flesh, and it is sacred and it is permanent. And this is the second part that we're maybe not as comfortable with sometimes talking about. There's a reason preachers don't like to talk about this, because it's obviously uncomfortable. And look, there's a lot of different situations out there. I don't know everybody's situation. There's a million different stories, and so I'm obviously not talking to any single individual here or any couple, but this is nonetheless a principle within Christianity that has been taught for years, has not been taught as much recently, and I think that we've suffered from it. And it's that Christ not only taught that marriage was between a man and a woman, but he taught that it was permanent. It's not something that you just walk away from if it gets hard. It's not something that you walk away from if things aren't quite going the way that you expected them to go. Now, obviously, there are certain exceptions to this. So in the case of Matthew, Jesus says that there's not going to be any divorce except in the case of adultery, in the case that one may commit unchastity. So that's in Matthew 19:9. In Mark 10, he doesn't necessarily say that, but these are obviously parallel passages. The writers are reporting what Jesus had said when he was speaking about this. And this is really important because even in societies where the marriage between a man and a woman was the norm, it was not the norm that you were expected to stay together forever. You could end it at a whim. In fact, what do they say here in Mark and in Matthew? The Pharisees, they're like, hey, Moses let us get divorced. And they're obviously asking him this because they probably heard him say something like this before. We don't get every single detail in the Gospels. And they say, hey, Moses let us get divorced. So what do you say? Can we divorce our wives if we want? And what does Jesus say? Well, he gives them an answer that is even more radical than we might consider his answer today about marriage being between a man and a woman. He gives them the answer of, he lets you get divorced because of your hardness of heart. This is verse 5. Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote the commandment for you to allow you to get divorced. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, let the two become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. This is where Christianity became radically different, even more so than in its definition of it being monogamous. Because now, it's permanent. It's something that God has done. When the two become one flesh, that's not merely a legal decision. It's not merely a social decision. There are legal ramifications. There are social ramifications. But when the two become one flesh, it is something that God himself has done. Therefore, Jesus' conclusion is in verse 9, what God has joined together, let no one separate. We talk a lot about this. People might ask, okay, so what are you saying then for our situation? Well, I'm saying this. If you're struggling in your marriage, fight for it. You don't have to wonder, am I married to the right person? You know how you decide if you're married to the right person? You look at your marriage certificate, you see their name, and that's how you know. There's no mystery to it. Now, obviously there are cases of physical abuse. There are cases of adultery. Jesus gave a specific exemption for adultery in Matthew 19. Most Christians would also agree that if somebody is being physically abused, then you would have the right to get divorced. There's obviously been a lot of talk about that. So what I'm saying is reconcile if you can reconcile. If you're still married and you're struggling, fight for that. It's not a mere decision that you made on a whim. It is an oath that you made before God. It is something that is meant to be permanent and binding. And it's not arbitrary. It's for the woman's good, it's for the man's good, and it's for the children's good. And this is the part where I think, if people aren't quite as into what Jesus has said about marriage, then maybe the social science, and I hate to say that, but the social science will open our eyes. We're modern people. This is how we think sometimes. When we say that God commands something as Christians, we always say that God commands that something for our good. God does not give arbitrary commands. Something is not good arbitrarily. Something is good because it is just, because it is righteous, because it flows from God. It's consistent with God's nature. So when he tells us something, he's not telling us something so that we can keep an arbitrary checklist and feel good about ourselves. He's telling us something for our benefit, for our prosperity. And every single ounce of social scientific data will tell you the same thing, that kids are better off when their parents stay together. And if there's no other reason to fight for your marriage, then that's the reason. Do it for your kids. Obviously, do it for God's honor. Do it because God has said so, because it is good and just, because you should love your spouse. All that is good. But I think, if you have kids, you know this, it even hits a little bit different when you start talking about the good for your kids. Because now it goes beyond you and it goes beyond them. It goes beyond your kids now. So, Sarah McLanahan and Gary Sandifer. I could quote a million studies. You go online, you'll see the same exact thing in like every study that's ever been done on this topic. But I gave this one for a specific reason. So they wrote a book called Growing Up with a Single Parent, What Hurts, What Helps, published by Harvard University Press. This was in 1994. Now, obviously we acknowledge that there are single parents who do a good job, that do a great job, in fact, that have no choice but to be a single parent through no fault of their own. And so, if you're a single parent here today or you know a single parent, this is not an indictment on you. Sometimes stuff happens that's out of your control, and we love you and we embrace you and you're part of our family, and that's how it's always going to be. But it's still, generally speaking, you can't argue with the data that kids who grow up with two parents, two biological parents that are married and have not been divorced, they experience better outcomes in every single aspect of their lives. Academic, behavioral, social, health outcomes are even different. This book was published by Harvard University Press, and it made all these claims. And obviously Harvard University, not to be confused with like Harding, So there's no Christian bias here, okay? When it comes to Harvard, they're publishing what they deem to be objective social scientific data by these two authors. Why do I share this with you? Well, the point is, when God told us that marriage was to be permanent and that we should fight for our marriage and that it's something that God has done and the two are one flesh, we're no longer separate. He did that for a reason. He did that for a purpose. It's for our good. It's for the man's good. It's for the woman's good. And it's for the children's good. I'm out of time, so I can't go into the good for all of the men and the women and all of that. But you get the point. Marriage, basically speaking, is between a man and a woman. The two become one flesh. And it is intended, though there are exceptions in extreme circumstances of abuse and adultery, it is intended to be permanent. This is for our good. It is not arbitrary. And how this changed the world? Well, just think about this. Before Christianity became so dominant, so prevalent in the world, what was prevalent about marriage? polygamy, multiple wives. If you're a wife today, you can just imagine what it would be like if your husband had like 4 other wives. Wouldn't be fun for you. Wouldn't be good for your kids, certainly. And it wouldn't be good for the man either, by the way. So polygamy was pretty much destroyed by Christian marriage, though some will say, but monogamy was kind of regular in the accepted view in the Roman Empire by this point too. That is true. But in the Roman Empire, there was no emphasis on permanence of marriage. You could leave a marriage whenever you felt like it, just as you kind of could in Judaism, which is what the Pharisees said. What changed with Christianity is that marriage became a much more serious oath. It was no longer just legal. It was no longer just political. It was no longer just social. It was something that God did, and he made it permanent. Intended to be anyway, in principle, in order to foster prosperity for the children and for the man and the woman involved in the marriage. And so when you look at the world around you and you see what we call the nuclear family, a man and a woman married with kids, raising them together, that is in large part the inheritance of Christianity. And there's hardly anyone today, outside of a few academic radicals, who would argue that the nuclear family is not a good thing. But the nuclear family was normalized and fought for and even put into law in a lot of cases, though divorce law has obviously changed now. But it put into law in a lot of cases by Christian sentiment. For the protection of the man, for the protection of the woman particularly, and yes, for the protection of the kids. And so as we go forward and as we begin to close, it's always, I think, a good reminder. And I think that preachers are sometimes guilty of this. I will say I've been guilty of this. We don't want to talk about this because obviously it's kind of controversial and you have to make all of these, claims that you're softening a little bit because you don't want to speak too generally, and we shouldn't speak too generally. But nonetheless, even though it is a hard message to give, it is still a message that we all need, and we need to give it a little more probably than we have. We have to emphasize what marriage is, both in definition and also in its intention. In definition, it is between a man and a woman. Those two become flesh, and God does that for us. In its application, it's permanent. It's intended to be permanent anyway. And so when we talk about the definition of marriage, I don't think that, you're being mean-spirited. You shouldn't find yourself thinking that. What you should think is we are giving this view of marriage because this is what is good. It is what God has ordained. It is for the good of all of us, all people that are included in it. And we should fight for it because God has made it fundamental to society, fundamental to human flourishing. And I think it's worth fighting for. It's worth preserving. And so when you talk about how Christianity brought good to the world, marriage and the nuclear family is something you can point to. At this time, Kyle's going to come up and he's going to lead us in a song of encouragement and a song of invitation. If you are here today and you've struggled with any of this, like I said, you're not alone. There are millions of people like you that have struggled in their marriage or have experienced divorce. God is certainly merciful. And so God is a God who forgives. So if you're somebody who's maybe done something that you shouldn't have done, God can and will forgive you if you will repent of that sin and ask him to forgive you. If you're someone who needs encouragement today, we would love to do that for you as well. If you have never given your life to Jesus, we would love to show you how to do that today through repentance and baptism. If you have any other needs, you can come forward as we stand and as we sing. Pure